Hi, everyone. Welcome back. This is episode 3 of Climate Basics, a podcast where we try to provide a optimistic and realistic perspective on green technology working towards the green transition. My name is Ty, and this is my colleague. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Greg Chang. And so
Oh,
very
we're doing last
very
names.
pleased
Ty Ha. Hi.
very pleased to be here, and I'm excited for today. Ty, as you indicated last episode, we're going to talk about hydropower today. And when you talk about being optimistic and realistic, I think that hydropower actually fits that bill.
Absolutely. This is tech that's been out for more than 100 years, and we've already seen it at scale powering huge cities.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, one stat I came across in looking at this was that I guess China, this is prior to their economic boom of the past 35 years, 40 years. They had just so many dams, but most of them were very, very small scale. So I don't know whether or not it was the 70,000 or 100,000 dams or what have you, but just an enormous number of dams that they estimated because it was just a main way for local areas to get some power that was fairly reliable. And so, as you said, this technology has been around for a long, long time, relied upon by people who aren't necessarily experts, but can make use of the technology using the water flow and then create some electricity. But of course, when the state gets involved, then tremendous things can happen.
Yeah. And in fact, if we're talking not just about hydroelectric, but hydroenergy in general, rivers have consistently been the source of energy and productivity for civilizations since the dawn of time. The early industrial revolution, before factories were powered by coal, were in fact powered by water mills. So the earliest manufactories, as the British called them, were sitting along rivers, and expansion and regulation of rivers was a huge part of early industrialization.
Right. And very effective as well, I guess. The fossil fuels, coal came in was the fact that it was portable, easily accessible. You could create it all over the place as opposed to having to
And
situate
you
it right
could
by a
control the
river.
supply and monopolize it, as opposed to expanding a river, where if you increase the flow of a river, every other competing factory on that river is going to also have an increase in production. Whereas with
Right.
coal, you can keep it in a warehouse with soldiers guarding it and control it. Yeah,
Yeah, very, very true.
but
Very
in
true.
fact, water energy was more efficient than coal energy for the first generation of factories. This is true. It was a logistics question, not a raw power question. And in that
That's right.
sense, hydroelectric is kind of a return to form, return to the older tech.
Yeah.
So
Well,
let's talk
in
about the
terms of
big
this,
dams.
sorry?
Let's talk about the big dams. We've got three gorges over in China. We've got
Yes.
the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam that just got started over in the Blue Nile. And I've heard there's even a bigger one that China's thinking of in the Himalayas.
Yes, that's right. That last one that you're talking about. So that's been announced, and I think that's rankling India because of this whole issue about
Yeah, it's at the headwaters
whoever's
of the
downstream.
Brahmaputra. That would be a huge, huge issue. Easily on
Right.
par with stemming the Nile as Ethiopia did to Sudan and Egypt.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so reading about these issues, these are very real, very significant issues for downstream countries. I
Yeah.
mean, it's not just a matter of being irritated. It's not just a matter of registering some concern. I mean, it's obviously vital, and it's
Water is
water
life.
security. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
but
a
but
security question, it's a diplomatic question, and it also brings in to light the fact that there are pre existing intergovernmental contracts, agreements for the use of all of these waterways that sometimes some of these dams can step on.
yes, that's right. Yeah, and in seasons where there is low water flow and increased demand upstream, of course, I mean it's just too easy to see that these are all problems. The 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 Ethiopia, the GERD sort of issue, the dispute or what have you, that seems to be just this simmering issue where sort of the downstream countries are just very, very annoyed, very unhappy with this.
Yeah, and yet
Yeah.
it happened anyway, and it might have a huge impact on the economy of the region.
But right, but regardless, I mean, I think dams. I've heard and read, lots of criticisms about dams, think you have to look at the local ecosystems, and you have to look at how you're affecting fish and fowl and everything else. But in terms of this, when I look at the overall spin-off effects, the sheer size that some of these dams can reach, the good that they can do, it seems to me that if the standard document or the standard assessment is the EIA, the Environmental Impact Assessment. If a dam can, get past that, that is produce an EIA which is satisfactory at that time to the regulatory body, then yeah, from my perspective, dams, I think that in terms of clean, I think that because they provide so much power and because they are renewable, I think that for me, it really fits the bill. I think they're great.
I mean, for me, it's an energy system that I've always respected and kind of wished we had more of. Let's we can come back to the environmental impacts a little bit later and the impacts on communities that are displaced as lands are flooded. We can come back to that later. Let's talk about energy production for a minute. I know that Paraguay is actually producing more than half of its energy from hydroelectric dams, for example.
Is it really? Okay.
Yeah, very impressive. And China,
Yes.
I looked at the list of top 10 hydroelectric dams. Half of them are in China, as
That's
far
right.
as size and capacity. That
That's
said,
right.
altogether, this tech is only producing about 15% of our global energy load.
Right. Only 15%.
Yeah, it's amazing, which is still more than half of all renewable energy together, and by far the largest single renewable energy production type.
Now that number, 15%, that is affected by the fact that energy demand globally just keeps on going up and up and up.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So it's every time I guess a major dam gets introduced, then it produces or it is able to produce a tremendous amount of power. So I guess the number, the percentage of its overall share of global power would jump up, but then you give it a year or two and global power demands move up, and then hydropower slips back down to around 15%.
What we're talking about is a design problem similar to adding extra lanes to deal with traffic.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
For those unfamiliar with that one, it doesn't work. It just makes more traffic across more lanes.
Right. Right. Well, the current issue du jour is, of course, the data centers, and in the United States, that's a huge issue that seems to be the driver right now of all the forecasts for increased energy needs and also investment driving. And
Maybe
so
that should be an episode. Maybe we should do one on AI and data centers. What do you think?
I think so. I think it's very timely and very important as well. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. And but yeah. So, but in terms of I mean, demand, like it's that the very sad statistic that is referred to commonly is in Africa, the continent of 600 to 700 million people just don't even have electricity. It's not even being electricity insecure. It's actually having an absence of.
Yeah.
And so demand is obviously it should grow, and yeah,
And
if
it should
hydropower
grow.
can be placed,
It should grow without increasing our carbon budget too, ideally.
right, right,
So Africa is a great place for hydroelectric in some spots, as Ethiopia is showing. It's also a great spot for solar.
yes, yeah, definitely. Well, there are superpowers in waiting, parts of Africa, obviously, as well as Australia, as well as other places. Any place with shorelines also has the ability to make use of offshore wind, and whether or not it's the offshore wind turbines or potentially what we were talking about a little earlier, the tidal water wave, the kinetic energy.
Tidal and wave energy is one of my favorite techs to watch out for. I really think that's going to be a chunk of our future energy production.
Right. Yeah. Well, with the permitting issues on land, on shore, and the NIMBYism, not wanting to run grid transmission lines through, not wanting to place wind turbines because they're unsightly, or the noise issue or what have you. So permitting problems in developed countries, I think, is pretty. I mean, across the board, it's pretty uniform. I think most developed countries have this issue where there are maybe a lot of applications for new projects that are being proposed to be put onto the grid, but of course the grid is constrained and to get through the approval process. So it does seem that offshore wind can avoid a lot of this.
No, I can attest to that actually. You in Toronto and me coming from Cleveland, we share the Great Lakes, and on Lake Erie, There was a project that some people put forward to do offshore wind on Lake Erie, which is an ideal spot. We get very constant wind with no resistance over a large area and many big cities that could benefit from it. In the end, it was local, as you said, NIMBY activism. What about the birds? Said everybody who owns cats, which eat more birds than windmills ever possibly could. What about the unsightliness? Okay, well, we did 200 years of ugly factories and nuclear power plants on the coast of Lake Erie. You had no complaints, and now you're opposed to some windmills. In the end, that project fizzled, which is unfortunate because energy prices are just getting higher, including in Ohio.
That's right. Yeah, it's funny when the time is right. When it's right, oil executives and natural gas executives they seem to be very very concerned about bird flight patterns
Yeah.
and also the aesthetic beauty of Lake Erie, which is actually just a strange way to put words together in one specific sentence, right? So,
Hey, don't diss Lake Erie. I grew up swimming there.
so anyways, Cleveland. I'm not a baseball fan, but I'm a total bandwagon fan, and as we are um, recording this, last night the Toronto Blue Jays made it to the World Series, and they did so on the back of a former Cleveland pitcher, Shane Bieber. He did a great job, got us sort of halfway through the game or what have you. I know none of this except for what I see on TV during the actual game, but I wanted to give a shout out to Cleveland. Thank you for giving us an assist there.
Cleveland sports. You only had to
Yeah.
wait about 60 years for us to start getting back on top.
But in terms of dams, Ty. So in terms of the U.S. situation with dams or new dams versus, I guess the leader really in this area is China building these dams and getting a lot of benefit from it. Is it, what have you seen in terms of this? The U.S.
Well,
really is.
it's not, I wouldn't say that there's momentum for building new hydroelectric dams. In fact, in the States, the general trend is that we've been tearing them down. And this is for a few different reasons. The best of them is that, and this is happening in Canada too, there were a lot of dams, especially in the Pacific Northwest, that were interfering with the migratory patterns of critical species like the salmon.
Right.
And there are some very important rivers where they are removing dams and instead recreating natural pathways for the fish to get back up the river from the ocean. And that is really important work. As you know, the traditional lifestyle of many of the indigenous people of that region had to do with the salmon and with the other fish that exist in these estuaries. And the dams very much stymied those ecosystems. So removing them is actually a huge ecological service and a point of environmental and cultural justice at this point. That
Right.
said, there's a second reason to remove dams after a while, and I suspect that that is a bigger factor than anybody's really talking about. What do you know
Which
about
is
deposition of sediments along the base of river systems in front of dams?
not enough. Maybe you could fill me in on this.
Okay, so basically every dam has a natural shelf life, past which it's not going to function anymore and is going to become an infrastructure risk. This is, of course, true with anything humans build. It collapses after a while. With nuclear power plants, the decommission time is about 50 years after creation. This is partly because concrete doesn't last that long, and there tends to be a buildup of toxicity of certain materials. This is true with windmills. They only last so long, and parts have to be replaced, right? But with dams, it's actually natural forces that are creating this time limit on them. Essentially, as a river flows, it picks up sediment, fine bits of dirt from everywhere upstream, and slowly deposits them downstream. That's why you have sandy embankments towards the ends of rivers, towards their mouths.
Right.
And when the water flows fast, it stays mixed in with the water. When the water slows down, there's an opportunity for that sediment to come out of the water and deposit in those slower areas. This is part of how rivers change the flow over the years. Now, when you build a dam, you build a place where the water slows down, even comes to a stop essentially before flowing through the dam, right? Everywhere there's a dam, there's now a buildup of sediment a little bit ahead of that dam that slowly, over decades, creeps towards the dam until you actually have far less water storage in that reservoir and instead just a huge layer of sediment. Uh, there's a few things you can do, of course. You can dredge it out, but
Right.
then if you think it's hard trying to place new windmills in developed countries, try figuring out places to put cubic meters, thousands of cubic meters of dredged up silt. It's a challenge. It's considered
Right.
a pollutant sometimes because some rivers are polluted enough that there tends to be extra materials in there. And also, it's just not as industrially useful as some other types of rock construction material.
Right.
So, figuring out a place to deposit all your built up silt is another logistical problem for long term maintenance of a dam. And if you
Well,
don't
how would
excavate it, eventually the dam could collapse because of the added weight and changed forces of water flow because of all that sediment.
right, that makes sense. How about a dam as iconic as the Hoover Dam? I mean, that's very old then,
Yeah.
is it not? I mean, so are they just constantly dredging? Is that an example of trying to keep that dam alive?
Dams that have a high amount of sedimentation in their upstream water flow, they are dredging, yes. I don't
Yeah.
know as much about the Colorado River. I never spent much time out west, but
Right.
I have to assume there's been maintenance of that sort, yeah.
Right. Yeah, and so I guess as you said, with any technology that you're going to install, there's always a lifespan. There's always some difficulty that you have to overcome.
Yeah.
I think that as long as the environmental assessment is acceptable, creating a dam probably is better than dredging out millions and millions and millions of barrels per month, per half year of oil,
That's
or
right.
natural gas and methane and all the rest of it, in order to sort of repeat the process with homes and repeat the process with cars, but instead electrify and use batteries and be a little bit more efficient that way, and start to discard the technology which has been wonderful for the past 200 years or 250 years or what have you, but to have a new way. So I hear what you're saying. I think that dams are not the perfect answer, but given our need to electrify, they still seem like a pretty good answer.
So you were talking about hydroelectric dams and their importance for filling in our grid with renewable energy.
Right. Yeah. And so when you need large projects like this, then I think hydro dams obviously fit the bill, and I think that's why the Chinese are going after it. I don't think it eliminates the need to also have large scale solar and large scale wind turbines both on and offshore, but with many of the developed countries, or all of them, I think that they have problems with the grid and with permitting. And so the infrastructure costs of upgrading, if you need to put in new transmission lines over new paths, then you have NIMBYism, you have permitting, delays or what have you. And so, yeah, if you're able to site a single project like a hydro dam and get that done and create a tremendous amount of power, it's a tremendous resource. Here in Canada, in British Columbia, fairly recently, I think it was last year, they started Site C, just a major hydro dam, and that's it's great. It's going to secure the BC power needs for a while, and of course BC on the coast is right beside Alberta, which is an economic engine, we have to say, but of course
Why is it an economic engine? Because of the tar
right,
sands and fracking.
because of the tar sands, right? Canada apparently has somewhere around the fourth largest oil reserves in the world, but it's expensive and dirty tar sands. And reading an article from a few years ago, I think we also have somewhere in the vicinity of, I don't know if it's 5,000 or 10,000, but both numbers are devastating. Orphaned wells with
Yep.
absolutely no solution or plan for dealing with them. They're just out there. Nobody knows what's going on with them, and the government turns away because there's no publicity about them.
In fact, this is a really important thing that we can use to distinguish renewable energy projects from the more traditional fossil fuel based. When a dam or a windmill needs to be decommissioned, you just take it down. The wind still flows, the river goes back to even better connection for a different ecological habitat. When a fossil fuel setup is decommissioned, you are stuck with huge rigs, pipelines, and land that looks like something from Mad Max or possibly the parts of Lord of the Rings that happen in Mordor, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
and
I've
so
seen
and
satellite
so
images of Alberta. For Americans, we think of Saskatchewan and Alberta, if we think of them at all, as essentially beautiful forests of pine trees with the occasional Mountie. That's our image of it. And I think that a lot of people would be shocked if they actually drove through and saw what became of those pristine forests.
yeah, yeah, that's very accurate, and unfortunately, it's completely true. I mean, so certainly those areas do have a very, very large swaths of land, which is pristine, which is lovely, which is where tourism is, and etc. But yeah, when you start to then go over the tar sands and other areas that are being worked over now for decades, yeah, Mad Max is an apt term. I don't know that you can actually describe it any other way. It's just an area that certainly humans don't want to be in, and you you just don't see animals there, and you've got tailing ponds, and you have basically devastated land. Again, no plants to
Disrupted
do
water
anything.
tables, leftover chemicals that are incredibly difficult to clean up. In fact,
That's right.
another episode we should do in the future is on bioremediation and different methods for dealing with some of the forever chemicals that are a part of fracking tech.
Right. Is that the hoped for fantasy episode that we're going to do that?
No, this is all science fact, no sci-fi for us. Just
Gotcha. Just
just
do
what actually is proven in at least the labs, if not in the field. That said,
right.
though, we're still on hydropower, so let's go back to dams. Having established them as, though environmentally cumbersome and though they're a huge initial investment, they are fairly easy to clean up compared to a lot of other types of energy and very reliable because rivers flow, right?
Right.
Another solution that is connected, another type of hydroelectric that I really want to mention that I would love to see more of is pumped hydro. So that's when instead of a flowing river, you have two lakes, one at a higher altitude than the other. And when you're getting load from the rest of the grid, say through windmills and solar, ideally, you use that to pump the water to the higher reservoir. And when you need to put energy back into the grid, you run the turbine like a regular hydroelectric dam and let the water flow into the lower reservoir. I think that that is a fantastic system. The only downside is that, like with regular hydroelectric, you end up flooding some areas to make the reservoir big enough to be effective. And also, it only works if you have a height differential of a certain degree that allows it to be energy efficient.
Right. I think that you've described it perfectly. I have to say though, Ty, so I understand pumped hydro now, and I do agree. I think it's a fantastic battery. I think that it's very valuable for a grid. But when I first learned about that, and of course just learning the concept of, so you're using electricity to move water from a lower point into a higher reservoir, and then you wait. I thought that I didn't understand that, and I thought that was sort of absolutely ludicrous. But it's because when you have too much energy or electricity being produced at certain times of the day, so whether it's solar during the day, whether it's wind at night, it typically, I guess, with grids that have high renewables, so solar and wind, you get in California, you get a depth curve, so you get too much production in Texas, in Spain, in Australia, all these places where they have high renewables, you get too much all at once. And so what I didn't realize was that when people in the industry talk about curtailment, so if you have too much energy being produced and you have to curtail it, that just means wasting it, just driving it into soil
Yep,
so it doesn't burn anymore.
yep.
But I didn't quite realize until I learned more about it that electricity has to be used instantaneously. The moment that it's produced, it has to be used. So then if you have you've got base load, whether or not you have some nuclear or whether or not you have natural gas plants or whatever your base load is that is providing you sort of the firm power that you know you're going to need that
The
day, and
average
then
use, yeah.
that's right, and other power comes in. Well, if you have a lot of solar panels, then you're just going to have a tremendous amount of electricity being produced from, say, 10 in the morning until about 4 in the afternoon, and it has to go somewhere. And so we don't have enough batteries on the grid. Batteries are expensive. There's billions of dollars being put into the technology right now to try to build longer term storage, but pumped hydro seems to check all the boxes because, of course, it's short, medium, and long-term battery use as long as you want it.
Yeah, it's true. Pumped hydro, where physically appropriate, can be used as that grid scale storage, which is, as referenced in episode one of the key issues for making the green transition happen. It's not about production. We can handle production of energy. It's about storage and distribution.
That's right.
That said, gravity, that is to say, kinetic energy storage, is one of the least proliferated and I think most promising types of energy storage tech. Yes,
Okay.
sure, chemical batteries have their place, and HFCs, as we talked about in that episode, also are very important. But for me, being able to physically store that energy is probably the most reliable way. So I'm a fan of pumped hydro. I'm also a fan of gravity storage, compressed gas storage, anything that does actual kinetic storage for that energy. Pumped
Gotcha.
hydro
And
being the most obvious and probably the most prolific right now.
right.
Actually, to go back to China being ahead of the curve there, just last year, or maybe 2 years ago now, they started the world's largest pumped hydro plant in Hebei province.
Did they really? Okay.
Yeah. It took about 10 years of construction, but I think it came online in 2023 or 2024.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah, and we just have to see more and more of these projects, and because, like you said, I mean, it's about being able to um, answer what the oil industry, of course, very loudly proclaims is the failings and the weakness of solar and wind, which is that it doesn't always blow and it's not always sunny or what have you. But given the fact that we have the modeling and we have all the historical records, we know that there is an excess of sun and an excess of wind. It's just a matter of capturing it, storing it, and then moving it to the times when we need it.
Because, as you very eloquently put it, the problem is that the peak production times for wind and solar don't match up with the peak usage times of the average city,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Just having enough storage to make up for that, to match peak production to peak load, that's the magic formula that we're missing right now.
Right. I did a quick little search as to whether or not, for pumped hydro, whether or not seawater was used, because it seems to me that with a shoreline, you're down to get lots and lots of places with elevation. I think the distance probably from the shoreline to cities might be an issue, but so in Japan, they did have a seawater pumped hydro project, and that lasted for a few years, but they actually ended up mothballing it because there was insufficient demand. I suppose it was just situated too far away, and they weren't able to figure out the logistics to make it profitable. But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But in terms of this,
There was
well,
another project in Ireland, I believe, where they were looking at a mountain with a bowl shape at the top that sits right next to the ocean, and looking at it, just thinking, how easy would it be to connect those two and just use that as a water battery, that whole cup of that mountain. And in the end, so far, they haven't built it. I think for a lot of the same reasons. It's a little bit rural, a little bit remote. It's not the ideal place to have that type of energy production, which is
right,
a shame because uh, this would be very promising for a lot of coastal communities. I can think of South Africa, for example, with a lot of urban spaces that are close to a coast with very mountainous terrain, where it could be an ideal spot for that type of usage. Also in Japan, they have a functional experiment in one of my other favorite types of energy production. Have you ever heard of ocean thermal energy conversion?
ocean thermal energy. Okay. No, go ahead.
So this is also more than 100 years old and has been experimented with by the US, by Brazil, and by Japan to various degrees of success. Essentially, the ocean has layers. The top layer is hot, the medium and lower layers are pretty cool. So the idea is you pump water from the surface that's nice and warm, and you also at the same time pump another tube of water from the mesopelagic, from the middle ocean, which is fairly cool. You run those waters next to each other, and then you have an energy gradient. And in that energy gradient, you can run a turbine that, because of the heating, changes pressure, and through that pressure, you can run a turbine. Now, the trick is you have to use a liquid that boils at a lower temperature than the average temperature of the heated surface water. Luckily, we have several options available for that. So in Hawaii and in Japan, they have functional scale models of ocean thermal energy conversion. The big problem is that salt water is incredibly corrosive. To put it
Yes.
mildly, it basically kills everything it touches over time. You know, there are very few metals that don't get eventually corroded by constant bombardment by all of the things that are in salt water. So salt water isn't just water and salt, it's also little tiny microscopic remains of every process, chemical and biological, that happened in the ocean. That's a lot of stuff. And I think that from the Hawaiian project that I was reading about, right now they figured out how to make it work, but you have to build everything out of titanium or something, which is incredibly expensive.
Right.
So cost prohibitive in terms of initial investment, but limitless energy production if you manage to build it and maintain it.
Right. Well, I think, what the lesson or lessons that I'm taking away from all of these hopeful technologies is based in optimism, which is that we all have to realize that fossil fuels were incredibly important. They still play a very important role today. They're transportable, they're easily accessible for the most part, and they're not flammable as long as we know how to handle them. And of course, we do know how to handle them. And so we've created an infrastructure surrounding the fossil fuels, and we've done that since time began, essentially for us. And so that's all we know. That's all we see around us. But it's gone from absolute science fiction that you could quote unquote harness the power of the sun, and that you could harness the power of the wind, and now you can harness the power of the waves and the water. As long as we're all thinking about this and open to these ideas, then I think that it becomes just very clear that we don't have to be tied, even though there are employment losses, even though there are national energy security issues, even though there are a lot of issues which affect the here and now, what's going to happen in our country for the next few years or the next decade if we were to switch over. I think the point is that there is so much possibility, so much possibility just using nature and what nature is giving us, not just the sediment which has been in the ground for millions of years, but also just the wind power and the water power, as you've indicated. I think it's all very hopeful, and I think it's just deserving of our attention. I
Yeah.
know that on Instagram and TikTok, there are a lot of very important influencers that are telling you to do this or do that or what have you, and they deserve hours of your time. But also, clean energy and renewable energy, that deserves a little bit of your viewing time as well. I think that's, it's hopeful. It's not all lost. Yes, there's a lot of fossil fuels still being used. Yes, coal is advantageous, it's cheap, it's easily accessible, lots of countries have a deposit. And yes, of course, the current administration in the US, which dominates our feeds, has a message of dig, 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 and all the rest of it. But there is hope, and it's happening. And it's one of these things where, again, I think in a decade we're going to look back and sort of scratch our head and say, who exactly wasn't on board with wind and solar and batteries? Who was that again? It wasn't me. I mean, it
Oh,
must have
we
been someone
know.
else.
We know. It's a handful of
Right.
CEOs. It's a handful of petrol guys. Uh,
Right.
Absolutely. There's reason to be hopeful. At the same time that we're having these conversations about, well, what tech do we use and how much of what, uh, inside the oil industry, they've known that there's an endpoint to it for decades. Frighten talks about peak oil and stranded assets. That is to say, their rigs and their refineries and their shipping containers and their pipelines eventually becoming not only useless but legal liabilities that they might end up having to actually pay for has been, I think, that if anything, the thing that keeps up at night these CEOs, the thing that they're scared of more than anything, is this transition because it's unavoidable. Because no matter how bad things get, no matter how long we keep going on with just this last 200 years of continued environmental exploitation, there's an endpoint. We're going to run out of oil. And possibly even before that, we're going to run out of patience for the way things always have been and always had to be since just the late 1800s.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is such a fine balance. Like, so you have protest organizations like Just Stop Oil and dozens of others, and
XR,
yeah,
Extinction
exactly.
Rebellion.
And you have the call from a very frustrated certain segment of society, including rightfully the young, who say rightfully, "Hey, I didn't cause this. You've got to be kidding me. Don't you see that there are better technologies?" And then, of course, you have then not only established interests, so leave that aside, but also just the need to continue to give people their lifestyle. Otherwise, you're just going to have breakdown. Right? Like people need to wake up tomorrow and the month after. They need to have electricity in the developed worlds. They need to have their lifestyle not immediately affected. But all of that to say, it is important for us to learn about and to support new technologies. And when politicians want to say that, let's see about whether or not we can permit to allow these new technologies to be on our in our state, in our jurisdiction, or what have you. I think that we can support those politicians who are open to this because, like you said, this is inevitable. It doesn't feel like it when you look at the carbon budget, which is being exhausted globally, and the fact that things continue somewhat unabated. But it's because we have what over 1 billion people on this earth without any electricity whatsoever, and they're banging on the door. And then you've probably got another 1.5 billion who are under electrified severely, and they're banging on the door.
Yeah,
So
we're
we
not
have
talking about disrupting their lifestyles.
right, right, because it's not fair.
Yeah,
But yeah, there's hope, and so I agree with you. And you have to look at things like so. We will build batteries, we will dig the mines, and we will produce. But then again, pumped
you're on
hydro.
radio.
But pumped hydro is just a wonderful way of doing it. And once you start looking at those possibilities and looking for those opportunities, I think you can kind of see them everywhere.
Absolutely. I hope so. I hope that we're giving an optimistic enough perspective. I know that the trend so far for the first few episodes is that you keep it optimistic and I bring some harsh realism to it. And I want to thank you for trying to maintain that perspective. We don't want people to feel guilty or hopeless or like there's nothing to do. And yeah, you mentioned supporting politicians that can see more than 3 months into the future. For me, I also want to shout out community energy co-ops. There are a bunch of
Yes.
options all over where you can help make your grid part of the solution rather than part of the problem. There's a lot
Right.
of solutions. Some of them are political, some of them. Most are economic. The fact that renewable energy is cheaper to produce now than any of the fossil fuels should be the bottom line. And that's, I think, the bottom line you have to go for when you're looking at local transitions.
Community energy, we definitely have to do an episode on that as well, Ty.
Yes, yes.
Because community energy, when you start to learn about it and when you start to look for it, then you realize it's everywhere. So community energy, just briefly, is a community coming together, avoiding the NIMBYism and saying, yes, we agree to put up, call it 20 onshore wind turbines in our local area, plus a whole bunch of solar and batteries. And then, of course, that local community will benefit because they will get the benefit of the cheap energy or free energy or what have you, which then allows for buy-in. Everybody sees a reduction in their bills, everybody is very happy, and everybody starts watching the windmills and seeing, hey, if it's not turning, then we have to call a technician out because that's saving me money. That sort of attitude, I think, is very powerful.
And it plugs in with you mentioned energy security, right? Well, what's more secure? Having a national grid that can be disrupted by bad actors using a little bit of hacking, or locally managed community owned energy grids for all of the different communities across the world? That's an unhackable system, and it's far more secure than a giant grid running off of a handful of giant power plants, right?
Right. I've run into, I guess Scotland has a pretty developed plan, and surprisingly, it's also very common in the United States in certain areas. Community energy is actually more proliferate than I realized. Yeah.
Speaking of Scotland, they actually have some of the most exciting tidal energy production experiments out there. We'll mention that when we get around to it.
I do want to say this before I forget.
Hmm.
So I don't think you're being quite accurate. You're not a voice that's bringing everybody to an uncomfortable reality. I think you're very precise, but in sort of privately, you're very optimistic. You're actually very optimistic. I think you're just trying to give everybody.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think you're just trying to give everybody sort of the realistic aspect, which is it's not all rainbows and lollipops. Yes, it is very, very difficult, but there is reason to be very hopeful.
Thanks for that. I do think that the optimism I bring is the optimism of somebody that has worked for years in sustainable development, in energy and food production, that has seen the pitfalls and the problems and the greenwashing, and still has hope for the green transition. It's a different type of hopefulness than somebody just coming in fresh and is like, oh, I'm going to go vegan and we just have to not grow cows anymore and we'll be fine. No, there's nuance to it, and I think the biggest thing to remember, and what we're doing with our series, with this podcast, is pointing out how there's hundreds of different solutions across all the sectors of industry and human life, each of which is part of the transition, each of which has a role to play. There's no silver bullet, looking for one is ridiculous, but there are a bunch of really important little things that each of us can do.
Well said.
Okay. Thanks everybody for tuning in to episode 3. We'll see you again next time. And yeah, we hope we helped.
Okay, thanks. See you later.